The rain didn't just fall, it assaulted the city, a percussive barrage against the windows of the county general ER. Inside, the chaos was a familiar symphony to Nurse Sarah Jenkins. The sharp beeps of monitors, the hiss of oxygen, the squelch of saline bags, and the clipped, urgent language of professionals fighting a losing war against mortality. It was 2 a.m. On a Tuesday, the witching hour when the city's worst luck bled out onto their gurneys. Sarah moved through it all with an economy of motion born from a decade in the trenches. She was a ghost of efficiency in blue scrubs, her face a mask of calm that belied the adrenaline thrumming through her veins. The squeal of tires, loud enough to cut through the din in the storm, was their only warning. The ambulance bay doors burst open, not for a paramedic crew, but for a phalanx of grim-faced men in dark, tactical gear. They were drenched, their clothes bearing no insignia, their expressions carved from stone. Between them, on a collapsible gurney, was a man who was more wound than person. "Trauma 1, now!" one of the men roared, his voice a gravelly command that brooked no argument. Dr. Evans, the attending physician whose ego was as inflated as a tension pneumothorax, rushed forward. "Who the hell are you? What happened to him?" "Just save him," the man snapped back, shoving the gurney toward the trauma bay. "He's got multiple GSWs, chest and abdomen. Tourniquets applied in the field. Massive blood loss." They swarmed the patient, a blur of hands and instruments. Sarah was already cutting away the blood-soaked remnants of a tactical shirt. The wounds were ugly, ragged holes that spoke of high-caliber rounds. The man on the table was built like a bull, his body a roadmap of old scars, but his skin was a waxy, terrifying gray. "Pressure's bottoming out! He's in hypovolemic shock!" Evans yelled, his usual arrogance replaced by a frantic edge. "Get me a line! Type and cross him, stat! Hang 2 units of ONEG right now!" A junior nurse fumbled with the IV. "I can't get a vein, they're all collapsed." "Then get me a drill. Entry osseous line now." Sarah was already a step ahead, grabbing the bone gun and driving the IO needle cleanly into the man's tibia. A grim but effective way to get fluids into a body that was shutting down. Blood and saline began to flow, but it felt like pouring water into a sieve. The patient's heart monitor, which had been a frantic, thready rhythm, began to sound a slower, more ominous alarm. "Where's that blood?" Evans demanded, his eyes darting toward the blood bank phone. "They're running the sample, but the pneumatic tube system is down because of the storm. Someone has to run it over." Another nurse called back. "We don't have time for that." The lead tactical man slammed his fist on a counter. "He's O negative. Just give him the O-neg." The charge nurse's face went pale. "We're out. There was a multi-car pileup an hour ago. We used the last 2 units." The air went out of the room. It was a death sentence. They all knew it. The man on the table was dying, not because they lacked the skill, but because they lacked a simple bag of the most common, life-saving blood type. His pressure continued to plummet. The long, drawn-out tone of the flatline was only seconds away. Sarah looked at the dying man, his life measured in the frantic drips from the IV bag. She saw the desperation in the eyes of his comrades, men who looked like they feared nothing in the world except this specific moment of helplessness. And something inside her, a core principle that had driven her into nursing in the first place, refused to accept it. Her own blood type, a fact usually relegated to a driver's license, suddenly screamed in her mind. "Oh, negative!" Time seemed to slow down. Dr. Evans was barking about calling the time of death. The men in black were frozen, watching their friend, their brother, slip away. Sarah saw the blood donation cart pushed against the far wall, a relic from a blood drive a week ago. On it lay a sealed, sterile 16-gauge needle and a blood collection bag. It was an insane thought. A career-ending, lawsuit-inviting, monumentally stupid idea. It violated every rule in the book. Unscreened blood, unauthorized procedure, a nurse acting as a donor in the middle of a trauma. But the alternative was a man dying. Here. Now. For no good reason. "The hell with this," she muttered under her breath. She moved with a purpose that silenced the room. She ripped open the sterile packaging, grabbed the collection bag, and tore the cap off the needle. "Jenkins, what in God's name are you doing?" Evans sputtered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Saving his life," she said, her voice steady. She cinched a tourniquet around her own bicep, expertly slapped the crook of her elbow until a vein popped, and with a practiced, painless motion, slid the large-bore needle into her own arm. Dark, life-giving blood began to flow down the tube, filling the bag. "Are you insane?" Evans shrieked. "That's a direct violation of everything. You can't do that. The liability, Stop this right now! Sarah ignored him. She looked at the junior nurse whose hands were shaking. Hang this as soon as it's a quarter full. Don't wait. Prime the line and run it wide open. The nurse, startled into action by Sarah's sheer force of will, nodded and took the bag. The men in tactical gear stared, their hard faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. Within a minute, Sarah's own blood was flowing from the bag, up the IV line, and into the dying soldier's arm. She kept her hand clenched into a fist, pumping rhythmically to speed the flow, the needle a dull ache in her own vein. Slowly, miraculously, the numbers on the monitor began to change. The plummeting blood pressure stabilized, then ticked upward 1 precious millimeter of mercury at a time. The frantic beeping of the heart monitor found a steadier, more robust rhythm. The waxy gray of the man's skin receded, replaced by a pale, but living, pink. They had pulled him back from the brink. For a long moment, the only sound was the steady beep of the monitor. Then, the lead tactical man walked over to Sarah, who was still connected to the blood bag, and looked her straight in the eye. He didn't say a word. He just gave a short, sharp nod of profound respect. Dr. Evans, however, was apoplectic. His face was a mask of crimson fury. "You're finished, Jenkins," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "When this is over, you are done. I will personally see to it." Sarah simply looked at the now stable patient, then back at the furious doctor. She felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She had drawn a red line in the sand with her own blood. Whatever came next, came next. The adrenaline of the night had long since faded, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and the lingering ache in her arm where the needle had been. Sarah walked into her next shift feeling like she'd aged a year in a single night. A quiet sense of pride was warring with a gnawing anxiety about the inevitable fallout. She'd replayed the moment 100 times, and every time she arrived at the same conclusion, she would do it again. A man was alive because of it. That had to count for something. It counted for nothing. She hadn't even made it to the nurse's station before she was intercepted by Brenda, the unit secretary, whose face was etched with a mixture of pity and fear. "Sarah, Mr. Henderson wants to see you, in his office. Now." The words were a death knell. Mr. Henderson was the hospital administrator, a man who saw patients not as people but as assets and liabilities on a balance sheet. He was a creature of the C-suite, a man who wore tailored suits that cost more than her rent and whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. A summons to his office, located on the top floor far from the messy reality of the hospital, meant one thing: you were being fired. The elevator ride up was a slow, silent ascent to her own execution. The sterile, beige walls of the administrative floor felt like a different universe from the visceral chaos of the ER. Henderson's office was vast and minimalist, dominated by a large mahogany desk and a panoramic window overlooking the city. Henderson sat behind the desk, his hands steepled, a portrait of corporate authority. Seated in a chair to his right, looking unbearably smug, was Dr. Evans. "Miss Jenkins, thank you for coming," Henderson began, his voice smooth and utterly devoid of warmth. "Please, have a seat." Sarah remained standing. "I'd prefer to stand." A flicker of annoyance crossed Henderson's face before being suppressed. "Very well. Dr. Evans has given me a full report on the incident last night involving the John Doe trauma patient. An incident in which you took some rather unorthodox actions." "I took the only action that would save his life," Sarah said, her voice level. Henderson picked up a pen and tapped it softly on a leather-bound notepad. The sound was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. "What you did, Miss Jenkins, was commit a breathtaking series of protocol violations. Let's list them, shall we? 1. You initiated a medical procedure far outside the scope of your nursing duties. 2. You introduced an unscreened, untyped, and uncross-matched blood product into a patient. It was my blood. I'm O negative. I knew it was safe," she countered. "You assumed it was safe?" Henderson corrected her, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you know the last time you were screened for hepatitis? For HIV? For any number of blood-borne pathogens that could have been transmitted to that patient? A patient who would then have grounds to sue this hospital into oblivion? Of course you don't, because that's not how this works. I'm saying," he went on, his voice a relentless, dispassionate drone. 3. You utilized hospital supplies, namely a donation kit, for an unauthorized purpose. That is technically misappropriation of hospital property. And 4, and perhaps most importantly, You expose this institution to a level of legal and financial liability that is, frankly, catastrophic. Sarah stared at him, dumbfounded. He hadn't once mentioned the patient's outcome. It was as if the man's life was an irrelevant footnote in a story about liability. He was dying. Dr. Evans was about to call it. We had no O-negative blood. We had minutes, if that. What was I supposed to do? Let him die to protect the hospital's bottom line? Yes, Henderson said without a flicker of emotion. That is precisely what you were supposed to do. You were supposed to follow protocol. Protocol exists to protect the patient, the staff, and the hospital. It is not a set of gentle suggestions to be discarded based on one's emotional state. Dr. Evans made the correct medical assessment. When a patient is unsavable by conventional and approved means, the tragedy is regrettable, but the hospital is not culpable. Dr. Evans finally spoke up, unable to contain his vindictive glee. What she did was reckless and arrogant. She undermined my authority as the attending physician and put her own ego ahead of sound medical practice. It was a grandstanding gesture, and we were just lucky it didn't kill him. The injustice of it was a physical blow. Lucky? I saved his life. His vitals stabilized the moment my blood went in. You saw it. What I saw, Evans sneered, was a rogue nurse performing a stunt. Henderson held up a hand, silencing them both. He leaned forward, his mask of civility slipping to reveal the cold predator beneath. The board takes this sort of thing very seriously, Miss Jenkins. Your actions have created a precedent that we cannot allow. We cannot have nurses deciding on a whim to practice medicine like it's the Wild West. We cannot have staff members making themselves the center of a medical drama. He closed the notepad and set the pen down with an air of finality. Effective immediately, you are on indefinite suspension without pay, pending a full review. I will be making a recommendation to the board for your immediate termination. Furthermore, we are obligated to file a full report of the incident with the state nursing board, which will almost certainly result in the revocation of your license. Your career in medicine, Miss Jenkins, is over. Sarah felt the floor drop out from under her. It was happening. It was actually happening. 10 years of dedicated service, of missed holidays, of cleaning up unspeakable messes and comforting grieving families, all erased by one act of compassion. You're firing me for saving someone's life, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. No, Henderson said, standing up. I am firing you for failing to do your job. Your job is to follow the rules. He gestured to the door. Security will escort you from the premises. You will return your ID badge and any other hospital property. You are not to contact any current staff members. Is that clear? She couldn't speak. She could only nod, a profound, chilling numbness spreading through her. 2 burly security guards, who usually spent their time dealing with drunks and belligerent family members, appeared at the door. They looked at her with something like pity, but their faces were set. As they walked her down the hallway, past the offices of people who had once been her colleagues, she felt 1,000 eyes on her. She was no longer Sarah Jenkins, the competent and respected ER nurse. She was a pariah, a cautionary tale. They escorted her to her locker, watched her pack a small box of personal belongings, and then walked her through the same ER doors she had entered with purpose just a few hours earlier. The sun was bright, the city was bustling, and the world went on as if nothing had happened. She stood on the curb, clutching her little box of shame, a brilliant nurse thrown out like trash for the unforgivable crime of having a heart. The first 48 hours were a blur of disbelief. Sarah's apartment, usually a sanctuary from the high-stress world of the ER, became a prison. The silence was the worst part. It was a thick, suffocating blanket, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of sirens, each one a painful reminder of the world she'd been exiled from. She paced the floors, replaying the confrontation with Henderson in her mind, his cold, clinical words echoing in her head. Your career in medicine is over. She did the only thing she could think to do. She called her union representative, a man named George, who had helped her navigate a minor scheduling dispute years ago. His voice, usually bluff and reassuring, was heavy with concern. Sarah, I've already heard, he said, sighing. Henderson's office sent over the preliminary file. It's not good. But George, I saved him. They were letting him die, she pleaded, the words tumbling out in a rush. There has to be something you can do. It's a wrongful termination. That's the problem, kid, he said, his voice laced with regret. From a legal standpoint, it isn't. They've got you dead to rights on the violations. You acted outside your scope, you used an unvetted biological product, they've got a mountain of regulations on their side. I can file a grievance, and I will, but their lawyers will tie it up in knots for years. They'll argue that you weren't saving a life. You were performing a reckless experiment that just happened to work. It's a brick wall, Sarah. I'm so sorry. The click of the phone ending the call was a nail in the coffin of her hope. The union, her only institutional protection, had effectively told her she was on her own. Her colleagues, people she'd considered friends, were silent. She knew why. Henderson's edict against contacting her wasn't just a suggestion, it was a threat. Anyone who reached out would be seen as siding with her, putting their own job in jeopardy. She was radioactive. The isolation was crushing her. She tried to watch TV, but the medical dramas felt like a cruel joke. She tried to read, but the words swam on the page. She spent hours staring out the window, watching people go about their normal lives, feeling a profound and bitter disconnect from the world. Every part of her identity was tied up in being a nurse. It wasn't just a job, it was who she was. Without it, she felt hollowed out, a ghost in her own life. The breaking point came on the third day. Her phone rang, an unfamiliar number. She answered hesitantly. "Is this Sarah Jenkins?" a smooth male voice asked. It was polite but had an unnerving metallic quality. "Who is this?" "My name is Michael Croft. I'm with the Risk Management Department contracted by County General Hospital. I'm calling regarding the incident on the morning of the 23rd. Risk Management, the hospital's guard dogs. I've already been suspended," Sarah said, her voice flat. "There's nothing left to say. This isn't about your suspension, Miss Jenkins. This is about the official report. I just wanted to inform you, as a professional courtesy, that as part of our standard procedure in cases involving the, let's call it, irregular handling of medical supplies and unconsented contact, we have filed a preliminary incident report with the city police department." The blood drained from Sarah's face. "The police? You called the cops on me?" "It's just a formality at this stage," Croft said, his tone infuriatingly calm, as if discussing the weather. "The report cites the unauthorized removal and use of a blood collection kit, which constitutes a property issue. It also cites the administration of a biological agent without patient consent as he was unconscious or physician's order, which could, under a certain interpretation of the statutes, be construed as a form of assault. Now, it's highly unlikely the DA would pursue charges, of course. This is mostly for insurance and liability documentation. But we felt you had a right to know that a police file now exists. Have a good day, Miss Jenkins." He hung up. Sarah dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor, but she didn't notice. Assault. Theft. They weren't just firing her. They weren't just taking her license. They were trying to brand her as a criminal. They were twisting her act of saving a life into an attack, a crime. That was it. The final thread of her resolve snapped. She sank onto her couch, the fight completely gone from her. She wrapped her arms around herself, but it offered no comfort. The tears she had been holding back for days finally came, hot and silent at first, then racking her body in great, heaving sobs. It was the sound of a spirit breaking. She had given her career, her heart, and even her own blood to a profession that was now casting her aside and calling her a criminal. She looked at her framed nursing school diploma on the wall, the oath she had taken to do no harm, to dedicate herself to the welfare of those committed to her care. It all felt like a lie. A sick joke. Henderson, Evans, the faceless voice from Risk Management they had won. They had beaten her down and shown her that in the cold calculus of the modern world, compassion was a liability and rules were more sacred than life. Despair, thick and suffocating as a shroud, settled over her. She was alone, jobless, and utterly, completely broken. Sarah was adrift in a gray sea of apathy. For another day, she did nothing. She didn't eat. She didn't answer her phone when her mother called, unable to summon the energy to explain the catastrophe her life had become. She sat on her couch, the television playing a muted, flickering light show that she didn't register. The fight was over. The despair had won. Then came the knock on the door. It wasn't a timid tap. It was a sharp, percussive thump, thump, thump. The kind of knock that demanded to be answered. Her first thought was that it was the police. Croft's threatening call had planted a seed of pure terror in her mind. They had come to arrest her. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she shuffled to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the peephole. What she saw made no sense. It wasn't a police officer. It was a man in a military uniform. Not just any uniform, but the deep green, immaculately pressed Army service uniform, adorned with a chest full of ribbons and the 2 silver stars of a major general on each shoulder. He was in his late 50s, with close-cropped gray hair, a jawline that looked like it could cut glass, and eyes that radiated an intensity that pierced right through the tiny lens. Behind him stood a younger captain, holding a leather briefcase, standing at a perfect parade rest. Confused and wary, Sarah undid the locks and opened the door a few inches. "Can I help you?" The general's eyes met hers. They weren't unkind, but they were assessing, powerful. "Are you Nurse Sarah Jenkins?" he asked. His voice was a low baritone, calm but resonant with command. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" "My name is Major General Thompson. I'm with the United States Army." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "May we come in for a moment?" "It's about the man you saved 3 nights ago." "Oh." Numbly, she stepped back, allowing the 2 soldiers to enter her small apartment. They moved with a disciplined grace, the general taking in the room at a glance, while the captain stood discreetly by the door. The sheer presence of the general seemed to shrink the space around him. He took off his service cap, tucked it under his arm, and looked at her directly. "That man was not a John Doe," General Thompson began, his tone serious. "He is Master Sergeant Mark Riley. He is a member of the U.S. Army's 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta, more commonly known as Delta Force." Sarah just stared at him, the name and the unit designation meaning little to her, beyond what she'd seen in movies. "Master Sergeant Riley was critically wounded during a mission of vital importance to our national security," the general continued. "His team brought him to your hospital because it was the nearest Level 1 trauma center. They told me what happened. They told me the hospital was out of his blood type. They told me the doctor was about to let him die. And they told me what you did." He took a step closer, his intense gaze softening slightly. "Nurse Jenkins, you didn't just save a man that night. You saved one of this country's finest soldiers. You saved a husband and a father of 2. You saved an asset that has taken this nation 15 years and millions of dollars to train, and you did it at great personal cost." Sarah felt a lump forming in her throat. "They fired me," she croaked. "They're taking my license. They told the police I assaulted him." A flicker of something cold and dangerous crossed the general's face. It was there, and gone in a second, but it was enough to make the air chill. "Yes," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I am aware of what they have done, and that is why I am here. We are going to go back to that hospital, you and I, and we are going to have a conversation with your Mr. Henderson. Captain, get the car." The drive back to County General was surreal. Sarah sat in the back of a black, government-plated sedan, the general beside her, his captain in the front passenger seat. They rode in silence. Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and a tiny, fragile spark of hope. They didn't enter through the ER. The captain led them through a side entrance to the administrative elevators. They rode up to the top floor, their arrival unannounced. The general's presence had an immediate effect. Executive assistants froze, their mouths agape. People flattened themselves against walls as he strode down the hallway, his polished shoes clicking with rhythmic authority on the marble floor. He didn't slow down as he reached Henderson's office. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door and walked in. Henderson and Dr. Evans were there, sharing a self-congratulatory coffee. They looked up, startled, their expressions of annoyance quickly melting into slack-jawed shock at the sight of a 2-star general filling the doorway. "Mr. Henderson?" General Thompson said, his voice deceptively mild. "Yes? Can I help you?" Henderson stammered, scrambling to his feet. The general stepped aside, revealing Sarah standing behind him. Henderson's face paled. Evans looked like he'd swallowed his tongue. "I am Major General Thompson," he announced, stepping into the room. He didn't sit, instead choosing to stand before the desk, an imposing figure of military might in the heart of a corporate office. "I am here to discuss the termination of Nurse Sarah Jenkins and the commendable actions she took to save the life of one of my soldiers." Henderson, recovering slightly, puffed out his chest and fell back on his bureaucratic script. "General, with all due respect, this is an internal hospital matter. Miss Jenkins committed serious protocol violations that—" "Your protocol," the general cut him off, his voice dropping an octave, "would have resulted in a dead American hero on your operating table. Her actions resulted in a living one. In my world, Mr. Henderson, we call that a successful outcome. We have a phrase for what Nurse Jenkins did: improvising, adapting, and overcoming. You seem to have a different phrase for it. Grounds for termination. The liability," Henderson began, his voice weak. "Liability?" The general almost laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. He turned to his captain. The file. The captain stepped forward and placed a heavy, leather-bound folder on Henderson's desk with a resounding thud. In that folder is a document, signed this morning by the Secretary of the Army and co-signed by the legal counsel for the Department of Defense. It is a full and total indemnification, absolving this hospital and every one of its employees from any and all liability, past, present, and future, related to the treatment of Master Sergeant Riley. Your liability concerns are now officially irrelevant. Also, he then turned his cold gaze on Dr. Evans. And you, Doctor? My men tell me you were prepared to watch Sergeant Riley die, that you actively tried to stop Nurse Jenkins from saving him. You should know that a full transcript of this conversation, along with my official recommendation, will be sent to the American Medical Association and your certification board. I'm sure they'll be interested to hear about your commitment to patient outcomes. Evans shrank in his chair, all the smugness gone, replaced by pure, naked fear. Henderson, desperate, played his last card. There was a police report for misappropriation of supplies, for assault. The general's eyes narrowed into slits. You called the police on a woman for saving a man's life with her own blood? He let the question hang in the air, heavy with disgust. That report will be expunged. In fact, I will be holding a press conference in 2 days. At that press conference, I will be presenting Nurse Jenkins with the Army's Award for Outstanding Civilian Service, the highest honor we can bestow upon a civilian. I wonder how it would look, Mr. Henderson, if the story got out that on the same day the U.S. Army was honoring this woman as a hero, your hospital was trying to have her arrested as a criminal? The threat was unspoken but perfectly clear. The public relations nightmare would be biblical. Federal funding, government contracts, the hospital's reputation, all of it would be in jeopardy. Henderson finally broke. He sank into his chair, his face the color of putty. He looked from the general's stone-cold face to Sarah's quiet, vindicated expression. He had built his world on a foundation of rules, liability, and protocols. And a 2-star general had just kicked it all down with the quiet force of absolute moral authority. The bureaucratic wall had crumbled. The silence in Henderson's office was absolute, broken only by the administrator's shaky breathing. The power dynamic had been irrevocably shattered. General Thompson stood like a statue, allowing the weight of his words to crush the resistance out of the 2 men before him. So, the general said, his voice returning to a calm, businesslike tone. Here is what is going to happen. You are going to retract Miss Jenkins' suspension, effective immediately. You are going to issue her a full salary for the days she has missed. You are going to expunge this entire incident from her employment record. And you are going to send a formal letter to the State Nursing Board, retracting your previous report and instead commending her for her extraordinary life-saving measures. Am I understood? Henderson could only manage a weak, jerky nod. Dr. Evans looked at the floor, refusing to meet anyone's eye. Good, the general said. He then looked at Sarah. Miss Jenkins, your job has been reinstated. Sarah found her voice. Thank you, General, but I quit. Henderson's head snapped up, a look of disbelief on his face. Sarah looked directly at him, her voice clear and strong, all traces of her earlier despair gone, replaced by a hard-won certainty. I can't work in a place that values its rulebook more than a human life. I became a nurse to help people, not to protect a corporation's assets. Oh, quote. A slow, approving smile touched the corners of General Thompson's mouth. An admirable decision, he said. He pulled a business card from his uniform pocket and handed it to her. When you decide what you want to do next, I want you to call the number on this card. It's my personal aid. The United States military has some of the finest medical facilities in the world. We are always looking for professionals with your initiative. We would be honored to have you. Sarah took the card, the weight of it in her hand feeling like a key to a new future. Her vindication was complete. She wasn't just cleared of wrongdoing. She was being offered a new path, one where her courage would be celebrated, not condemned. As they turned to leave, the general paused at the door. One more thing, he said, looking back at Henderson. I expect your full and enthusiastic cooperation with my office in the planning of Nurse Jenkins' award ceremony. I'm sure you'll want to issue a press release of your own, celebrating the heroic actions of your staff member. He didn't need to say more. The final turn of the screw was complete. Henderson would now be forced to publicly praise the woman he had tried to destroy. They left the office, leaving the 2 men to the ruins of their authority. Walking down the hall, Sarah felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in days. It was more than just relief. It was the profound satisfaction of justice served. Before they reached the elevator, the general stopped. "There is someone who would like to meet you," he said gently, "if you're up for it." He led her not to the exit, but to a different wing of the hospital, one with a security guard posted outside the door. Inside, the room was quiet, the harsh fluorescent lights of the ER replaced by a softer glow. In the bed was the man, Master Sergeant Mark Riley. He was propped up on pillows, his chest and abdomen swathed in bandages. An array of monitors beeped softly beside him, charting his steady recovery. He looked exhausted, pale, but very much alive. His eyes, a clear, startling blue, found hers as she entered. The general gave her a small nod and discreetly stepped back, giving them space. Sarah walked slowly to the bedside. "Hi," she said softly. Riley's voice was raspy from the intubation tube that had only recently been removed. "You're her," he whispered. "The nurse." "I'm Sarah," she said, a small smile forming on her lips. He motioned weakly with his hand, and she instinctively took it. His grip was surprisingly strong. "They told me what you did," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "They told me I was gone, and then you brought me back." "I'm just glad I could help," she said, the words feeling inadequate. He shook his head slightly. "No, you did more than help. You gave me back to my wife, to my kids." A tear traced a path down his temple and into his hair. "They told me you have Oneg." "Me too." He gave a weak squeeze of her hand. "I guess that makes us family now? Blood brothers? Or, blood sister and brother?" A laugh escaped Sarah, genuine and clear. For the first time, the incident wasn't about rules, or administrators, or career-ending threats. It was about this man, in this bed, who would get to see his children again. It was about the simple, profound connection of one life given back, a debt that could never be repaid, but would be forever honored. "Thank you," he whispered again, his eyes heavy with exhaustion and a gratitude so deep it was humbling. "You just get better, Sergeant," she said, squeezing his hand back. In that quiet room, holding the hand of the man she had saved, Sarah finally understood. She hadn't just made a choice. She had answered a calling. 3 weeks later, the city was draped in the golden hues of early autumn. Sarah sat at a small outdoor table at her favorite coffee shop, a steaming mug warming her hands. The public fallout from the incident at County General had been swift and brutal for the administration. General Thompson's press conference, where he lauded Sarah as a national hero, had been picked up by every major news outlet. The story of the angel of the ER, who was fired for her heroism, became a viral sensation. The hospital, under immense public pressure, had issued a groveling public apology. An internal review was launched, and though the official results were confidential, the rumor mill churned with the news that Mr. Henderson had been encouraged to seek other opportunities, and Dr. Sleece Evans had been quietly reassigned to a research position with no patient contact. Sarah had watched it all from a distance, feeling a sense of detached vindication. She had already moved on. The day after her meeting with Sergeant Riley, she had formally submitted her resignation. It was the easiest decision she had ever made. She took a sip of her coffee and looked at the crisp, official letter lying on the table beside her. The letterhead read, "Department of the Army, United States Army Special Operations Command, Fort Bragg, North Carolina." She had made the call, after several interviews with colonels and surgeons who treated her not as a liability but as a legend. The offer had arrived. Civilian lead trauma instructor for the Special Warfare Medical Group. Her job would be to train the next generation of Delta Force and Green Beret medics, using her real-world experience to prepare them for the chaos of the battlefield. They wanted her specifically for her ability to think outside the box, to value the patient above the protocol. The very quality that had ended her old career was the foundation of her new one. A faint smile played on her lips. She thought of the night that had changed everything: the rain, the chaos, the dying soldier, and the split-second choice. She had broken the rules, and the system, in its cold and rigid fury, had tried to break her, but it had failed. She had held fast to the simple, unwavering principle that had guided her from the very beginning. You save the life that is right in front of you. She picked up the letter, her acceptance of the new position. A profound sense of peace, one she hadn't felt in years, settled over her. She had been tested, cast out, and ultimately redeemed. She had faced down the soulless bureaucracy and, with the help of an unlikely ally, had won. Her horizon was no longer the closing doors of a hospital that had betrayed her, but the wide-open gates of a future where her courage, her skill, and her heart would finally be home.